Welcome to the Ideas Hour with your hosts David Cameron and Suzanne Zeedyk, exploring big ideas that matter. This series was originally broadcast on Teacher Hug Radio in 2021 and 2022. It is still available in their archive as well as in this format.
Today we're exploring one of the biggest ideas of all, the ideas of Charles Darwin. Their common currency, evolution, survival of the fittest, natural selection, we all know them, they trip off our tongues. They're also ideas that have been enlisted by all sorts of people to justify all sorts of views. But do we really know what Darwin thought or what the implications of his ideas actually are? That's what we're going to explore today. We're exploring Darwinism, but the real Darwinism. It turns out that maybe we don't know his work as well as we think we do. And it also turns out that once we do understand Darwin's ideas, they have a lot more and a lot different relevance for the education system and for teachers than we've realized up until now.
And the person who's going to help us to do this is Ben Bradley. He has a new book out, released last autumn, called Darwin's Psychology, The Theatre of Agency, from Oxford University Press. It's had very welcome reviews, with one reviewer describing it as a marvelous gift of psychology, and another as truly extraordinary in its careful comprehension of Darwin's words and their relevance for modern understanding of behavior, whether in animals, plants, or humans. Ben, welcome. You are coming to us from Australia, and we're delighted to welcome you to the Ideas Hour.
Thank you, Suzanne and David. It's marvelous to be here.
Well, let me just tell listeners that you did your training as a psychologist at Oxford University and then in Edinburgh, where you worked with pioneering researcher on babies, Professor Colwyn Trevarthen, and some of my followers in particular may be really familiar with his work because it was eminent and groundbreaking. And you were particularly insightful at talking about babies' capacities already to participate in groups. And then you emigrated to Australia, and you now hold the post of Professor Emeritus of Psychology at Charles Sturt University. So let's jump into your book and have a conversation about it. Ben, can you tell us what the central thesis of your book is?
So, in brief, Darwin's view of living things, of nature, was that it was a theatre of agency, which I'm sure we'll talk about a little bit more. It means that all living things are deeply interrelated with the habitat in which they live. And when that translates to his evolutionary theory, it has certain effects which we're not familiar with, I think, in the 21st century. And when it translates into psychology, it leads to us realizing that human beings start from group relationships.
Oh, that is fascinating, because that is a different take on Darwin than we often get, because we've looked much more at the individual.
That's right. That's right. We hear that he's the man who told us we were selfish, we were run by our selfish genes, that nature is red in tooth and claw, and it's a war of all against all. And I would challenge that. I think it's that plus a lot of other things.
Okay, so let me just ask one other question just to really help our listeners engage with that. Why do you think this idea about group matters? Why do you think the ideas at the core of your book matter to our modern discussions?
Well, I think with education in mind, if we start from the idea that human beings come from an evolutionary past to be group animals, related, capable from early infancy, as our research shows, and Darwin's theory predicts, capable of relating to each other in groups. It asks us to think about evolution and human beings in a framework that is not individualistic, that is not just focused on the individual, but has a group dimension from the beginning. And I think that changes an awful lot of the way we think about what human nature is.
And I absolutely love that. I love the drama of the way that you spoke about Darwin, because that's so much the kind of caricature. And I think in education, we've been really challenged by that. And there's a real return to kind of traditional values in English education in particular, to some extent in Scottish education. And I think there are real issues around challenging that caricature version of Darwin that you outlined so brilliantly there. But just talk a wee bit more in detail, Ben, about how these ideas that you are now bringing to the fore from Darwin are relevant to teachers in the education sector, because most of our audience will be teachers, although Suzanne has got a much wider reach than that. So who knows who's out there listening to us. But for the teachers out there, Ben, do you want to amplify the implications for education, teachers and schools?
Well, love to, David. I think, so my research for 40 plus years, as Suzanne mentioned, has been with regard to the really early part of childhood. And even there, where our ideas are being taken up by some of our colleagues who own childcare centres in Australia, the reorganisation of the infant room, when you think that groups are to the forefront, has all sorts of implications for both what educators need to do and what babies turn out to be able to do. So that's just at the level of infancy, how you organise the room, how you expect, whether you can expect infants to collaborate. You find that they do, and I can give examples of that. But then if you work on up through the age ranges, the idea of small group teaching, I know it's a theme in discussions of curriculum, across the world, and I suspect, particularly in Scotland, but if you want to set up your classroom to encourage group-based education and to think even about recreation in a group-based way, you're going to have to think about assessment, you're going to have to think about the dynamics of groups, you're going to have to get children to learn how to ask questions and to listen to each other. It's going to be a very different set of ways of training and thinking about and projecting education than perhaps is traditional. Although I think there is a strand of educational practice that this relates to, and some of the listeners will be much further across that than I am. And then you can take it up into secondary, and I've used group-based education with 17 and 18-year-olds at the starting university, where there are all sorts of techniques like collective biography and various group-based methods, which are much more engaging for the students.
I think this is brilliant, because in a sense, Ben, this is part of the work that Suzanne does on a regular basis, is to use scientific theory, philosophy, beliefs, whatever, to inform discussions that are already ongoing. And you've really captured that, I think, brilliantly. And this is something that I've no doubt that we will come back to. But Suzanne, do you want to take us a bit further forward in terms of the overall issues around the book?
What's really fascinating about this discussion and your book, Ben, is that it's just lots of people have not realized that there is a conversation to be had. So will you just tell people more about why you wanted to publish this book? I mean, going back to read Darwin in the original is not something that most people do. Tell us more about your motivation to help people to understand this.
Okay, so my research began in Edinburgh with Colin Trevarthen, looking at mother-infant interaction. I pushed that research forward, and then my partner, Jane Selby, ran a conference in which some psychotherapists came who showed us some videotapes of mother baby groups, mothers who were having difficulties with children who didn't sleep at night or postnatal depression or feeding problems, but they brought their babies along. And the therapists, Campbell Paul and Francis Salo, showed that the babies were acting as full members of the groups. They were actually part of the dynamic. And we saw the videos and we thought, what happens if we put babies together in groups without adults present and just set the cameras running, not children with problems? And when we did that, we found that babies are capable of group interaction. They can interact with more than one baby at once. They can respond to more than one other baby at once. And there was no theory that explained it. And then I tripped over Darwin. I was asked to make a film for Darwin's 200th birthday. And I made a film, but I did a bit of reading, and I realized that his theory was the only one that would predict that babies would be capable of group interaction almost from birth, because he believed that was the basis of the growth of the human brain, that our environment, when we became human beings, was distinctive because our environment was a group of other familiar people, and it was that interacted, it was that group that interacted with the environment, not just us as individuals. And so we had, first of all, to learn how to be in a group, and it was the group that then fed and protected us. So having found that, I thought, well, there must be much more to Darwin than I thought. And I'd always been taught that Darwin was a forefather of psychology, but there was no book published on Darwin's psychology. And I thought, this is extraordinary. It was a bit like opening finding a new room in an old house that I'd been living in for the last 40 years. Darwin was a psychologist. I didn't believe it. So I just got really excited about that and got a contract to write the book quickly. And so then the unfortunate thing about Darwin is he wrote so much, and so much has been written about him, that it took quite a long time to read him properly. But I didn't look back. I think he's a really nice person to spend time with, and fascinating ideas.
So if I give that back to you, Ben, what you're saying is that Darwin gives us a different sense of ourselves than we often have, because it's not so individualistic. It's much more collective and group-based. And that's both a different sense of ourselves and a different sense of Darwin. That's at the core of what you're saying. Is that right?
Yes. I think the century of the gene, which was last century, the 20th century, when we discovered the gene, and we discovered genetics, and we discovered DNA. And I think we felt very proud of us. The scientists felt very proud of themselves. They'd understood heredity and all those kinds of things. Then Darwin was rather seen as the man who came up with a theory that made the gene important. And it was forgotten how broad and insightful a scientist he was, and that one of his main aims was to develop a psychology. So even though we have people called evolutionary psychologists now, none of them seem to know that Darwin actually was ahead of them by about 150 years. He actually came up with the psychology, in the 1870s is really when he did it, about 15 years after the Origin of Species first came out. Yeah, and it's just a very rich seam of research to look at what Darwin said. Somebody said, I think, the only new thing in the world is a history you don't know. And I discovered that Darwin was a history I don't know.
That's what makes this a big idea.
And this is absolutely brilliant, Ben, because one of the things that we're trying to do through this whole series is to get people, in my terms, to dance with dichotomies. One of our concerns is that people are too ready to embrace headline ideas, barely understood. And you and I and other correspondents have talked about Darwin as being one of the most quoted but least read thinkers in the world. But what people have done is they have grabbed on headlines. They've grabbed on the apparent starkness and simplicity of some of Darwin's ideas, and then used it for their own purposes. And I think what you're doing brilliantly around this is emphasizing Darwin's open-mindedness, the complexity of his work, the range of his work. And I think that's a brilliant way into it. And if I may say, before I give you the chance to speak, it's fascinating how the ideas that you're putting out through this book chime with things like Sapiens which are taking a totally different approach to looking at history and development, but coming up with many of the same conclusions that you're coming up with around the importance of interagency as well as agency.
Yes, I think that's right. I think agency is a term that's becoming more and more popular or more and more relevant across psychology, but also in talking about plants and animals. And Darwin's, one of his great masterpieces, which people won't know much about, it came out, he brought it out just a couple of years before he dies, was called The Power of Movements in Plants. And he did these meticulous studies of plants, both their roots and their growing tips, showing that they were what he called intelligent. And because they solved problems, if he put, he blocked them in as the root was trying to find its way down into the earth, they found a way around the blockage. And that was the beginning of the discovery of plant hormones. So there's a complete, that's why I sometimes say he did the psychology of plants as well as animals and human beings. And so he was a very curious man, in the sense that he wasn't perhaps an unusual man in himself, although one could argue that he was, but he had an enormous curiosity about the world. And one of the things that I certainly got out of him, having spent 8 years researching and writing about him, is that when I look at a garden or a view, or I'm walking on through the bush in Australia, as we call it, the idea that it's a theatre of agency, that everything that's alive around us, including, of course, the human beings, are living at different rates. They're interacting, they're interweaving, their fates and their trajectories are all bound up with each other. I find that quite inspiring. I find that the world is a much more homely place and a more interesting place than it would be if we thought of it as purely mechanical. And I think we've been in love with mechanism, and I think we're bringing agency back in, and various different fields of research and fields of study, and as you describe, across many disciplines.
Yeah, and the whole idea of agency, I think, is incredibly timely, because within the whole education world, there's a great deal of discussion around the idea of teacher agency. And there's a sense, I think, in many parts of the world, that we've deprofessionalized teaching, that we've trained teachers rather than educated them, if that makes sense to you and to the listeners. And that what we've done, in a sense, is that we've attacked agency and sacrificed it on the altar of purpose. And the narrower our purpose, if it's focused entirely on attainment, then the less agency we allow around that. Is that a helpful way to take some of your ideas forward into that wider debate about teacher agency and professionalism?
Yes, David. When you initially began talking to me about that through email, I looked at the work on teacher agency, and it's interesting. Of course, we're all agents, whatever we do, we're all acting, but the capacity to be creative as agents depends on our environment, on our ecology. And the debate about teacher agency is very much also about the world in which teachers are called upon to act. And if it's a very prescriptive world, full of regulations and assessments which are coming from outside or top down, then the room in which their creativity can work is limited, and their agency is therefore less powerful. But if the creativity, the space for creativity is opened up, if the ecology, if you like, of the school encourages the teachers to look into their classroom and create with the students, I think that will be a much more powerful form of agency. And I know in my own experience as a university teacher for many years that the regulation, which we call NAPLAN in Australia, which is the National Australian Program for Literacy and Numeracy, children from the ages of, I think it's 6 and 9 and 12, they're all being assessed by this tool for assessing numeracy and literacy, and schools get assessed on the results of these tests, and so teachers have to teach to the tests. Now, assessment is likewise in universities more and more rigorous, at least in Australian universities, and the sense that I had that I could teach a course on developmental psychology or child psychology and shape it to the latest movements in research as I knew them as of this week, have almost completely gone, the chance of doing that. And I think that goes all the way down the age ranges, that you need an ecology which encourages teacher agency if teacher agency is going to be the focus for discussion.
That's the classic, I wish I'd said that answer, Ben. Well done. Brilliant. This is ceasing to become an interview and becoming a relationship. Suzanne, do you want to come in?
Ben, can I jump to practice for a moment? So I think there are many of our listeners who will be fascinated to have heard you say that. And they may have thought that their frustration with having to teach to the test, because so many teachers express that frustration, they may have seen it as a really individualistic thing for them. In other words, they are frustrated as an individual teacher. But you are really linking that to a wider science of what it means to be human. Is that right? Can you just unpack that a bit more to help us to think beyond? It's not just frustration. This is actually about how we function as humans. What should I do with that in my classroom? That insight that you're giving this, what would you recommend they might do?
Well, I think the insight that I get from working with Darwin, this idea of a theatre of agency, is that I want to say, but it's slightly wrong in terms of a metaphor, that there are many moving parts in the classroom. There are many living creatures in the classroom. And even Darwin would call agents, he would even refer to physical aspects of agency, to the environment. He talked about the wind and the tide and the rain and the soil as being agents in a habitat, what he called a habitat. He didn't use the word environment. But if you're going to create a habitat or a classroom in which agency can flourish, I think that partly, of course, the settings are external to the classroom. They're structural. But if you're just thinking of a teacher in a classroom, it seems to me that you've got a lot of what I'm calling moving parts, living parts, let's call them. And looking at some of the research on group teaching, even the rearrangement of the classroom enlivens it. And as the children get older, if you teach in groups, which again is in a sense enlivening the children because you're giving them more roles for them to play, as they become more sophisticated in groups, you can begin to get them to reflect on the group processes. And given that we are group animals, I believe it's obvious, even from the way that social media works, I think that it's obvious we form groups almost naturally, let alone the fact that we have families and teams and organizations which are all group-based. I think that if you have that group, you look at the world through that group prism, you see that there's an awful lot of what psychologists call metacognitive, which means thinking about how we do things that get put on the agenda that weren't on the agenda before. So there are lessons to be learned, or there are experiences to be gained that would never exist if we didn't do that reorganization in the first place. So, I mean, I don't want to teach teachers how to teach because they know how to do it better than I do. But it seems to me that I, in my own experience of reorganizing the classrooms in which I teach, making circles, making sure that it's democratic. So, for example, in a collective biography, like the ones that I would run, everybody's asked to give a brief story about why a particular concept like memory or pain or something means, or even psychology itself, what it means to them, a brief story. And I would give a story too. And when we went round, I would be subject to the same rules as the other people in the group, as the students in the group. And that sort of, again, there's a sort of democratization of the process, which group a group perspective brings. And I think that again extends agency. It makes it a social form of agency. It makes it a relational form of agency. And I think that agency can be seen as a very individualistic thing itself, but that's not the Darwinian perspective as I read it.
Ben, I just think this is so exciting because you are really giving people a deeper sense of what it means to be human and what we might do with that science.
Ben's reference to the use of stories just resonated so much with the wonderful quote from Daniel Willingham about stories being psychologically privileged. And Hal Roberts, who's another presenter on Radio Hug and a colleague of mine, uses that whole idea of taking the story as one of the key narratives in teaching. And so it's just to keep pointing out those brilliant synergies, Ben, that you're coming up with, and the ability that you're demonstrating to link ideas from conversations that you haven't been directly involved in. I just think it's so reassuring to get that level of overlap.
David, can I come in? Because I was thinking that as well. Alison Gopnik, who is another developmental psychologist that people might want to have a look for, talks about two ways of thinking about children. Do we raise them as gardeners or carpenters? Then you're clearly saying that if we thought of ourselves as gardeners, that we were creating a habitat or an environment in which children can flourish, rather than trying to manage their growth, we would have healthier, more dynamic individuals and communities. And so will you just expand a bit more on that idea of habitat, if you would? And in fact, I'm starting to think about a lot of the work on trauma that is being done and adverse childhood experiences. What happens if you grow up in a habitat that is really stressful? Plants don't do well, animals don't do well, and guess what? Human beings don't do well either. So just, if you could weave that together, tell us about habitats, but particularly if they're stressful, which is what happens in trauma.
A couple of things there. The first thing that I found, and I think comes through from what both you and David are saying, is that when you open up that conversation, when you try and make a space for the students, for the children to become agents, or their agency to become more creative, you bring in their worlds. And what sometimes happens in a very out of touch teacher, and or lecturer, let me talk about myself, an out of touch lecturer, is you don't actually know the worlds that the students are coming from. And in psychology, which is of course what I've been teaching for several decades, the experiences that some people have had in the room are so different from my own that to hear their stories is to enrich everybody, is to realize that the habitat these people are coming from are really different, are really, really different. And it deepens the conversation in an important way. Now, one of the things I also found is, of course, that when the stories come in, when the stories start to meld and to sort of interweave, we have to allow space for traumatic stories. And that is challenging. If you're talking about professional development and so on, that is I wouldn't call it a risk, but it's a consideration. It's bound to touch on issues if it becomes a safe environment, a safe habitat for children to talk in, that things will come in which are very significant, but not necessarily, they don't stop at the classroom door. They go back into the community and reflect on the community. Now, one of the things that we've talked about before, Suzanne, prior to this, the conversation, is the ways in which a rich versus an impoverished environment can form part of an understanding of evolution. And of course, one of the terms there that people use is epigenetics. And epigenetics is really a way that genes are turned on and off. And that's something that's much faster. It's a much faster process than we think of evolution as being. It can be intergenerationally transmitted. It doesn't require mutations and recombinations, all the things we've been taught about. And so intergenerational effects are part of the new evolutionary. And I should say, when I'm talking about Darwin, I'm only able to see Darwin in this much broader light because evolutionary biologists themselves are moving beyond the gene. It's a kind of coming back together of the breadth of Darwin with the breadth of evolutionary science. But in that process, I think we're recognizing that development is a hugely important part of, obviously, an individual life, but also part of evolutionary theory. So trauma and stress are things that I think probably all teachers need to know about, and certainly in the school where I was brought up, where it was very top down, the last thing I would admit to was any form of stress. Boys don't cry was just the beginning. You wouldn't let on to anything unless you were well locked into some toilet at the end of a dark corridor. And so I think that the way that we deal with the stresses and traumas, again, I'm no expert. You're the one who brought it into the conversation, Suzanne. So that's my best attempt at sort of linking it to the Darwinian ideas.
But Ben, what you just said, I've written down. You just said we need to allow space for traumatic stories. And you start to realize that our systems have traditionally not allowed such space. So teachers may have no idea of the background that children come from, and therefore they can't make sense of the behavior that is in front of them. And very often we then assign bad intent to it, and we actually make things worse because of the way we interact. So I'm just loving that you can bring together Darwin's insights with whole other areas of science to make more sense of the children, the people, and the communities around us.
Yes, I agree. I think that we sort of think of evolution as something that's done and dusted and sort of inscribed in our genes. But the way Darwin thinks about evolution is the theater of agency. The agency of animals and plants and humans is what leads evolution. The genes are followers. Our actions and our development and our plasticity, as people talk about it, our impressionability, is what leads evolution. So in a funny way, and another thing he says is that with human beings, natural selection is a subordinate concern. The most important thing is schooling, he says, in leading human progress, in producing human progress. So how we do the schooling, as far as he's concerned, is the top consideration. The natural selection has given us the basis. It's given us what he calls social instincts, primarily sympathy, but also the capacity to read others and to imagine how they're reading us, which is fundamental to how he sees conscience working and facial expressions working and sexual attraction working and language working, all those things. So we have this basic given of a capacity to read and be read and to imagine others reading us, and that often shapes how we think we should behave or how we criticize ourselves. But above that, on that foundation, is what he calls the institutions of civilization. And he would, civilization had a slightly different sense in the 1800s, but it basically meant complex societies like the one he lived in. But what made that a civilized society or not was not the genes we had or the history we had. It was what we built on those foundations.
Yeah, and there's so much in that, Ben. One of the things that you do brilliantly in the book is you talk about the way that Darwin studied behavior in order to learn, and he had that. You have the wonderful example of the moth with the eyes on the wing, and he could not understand the physical manifestation until he'd studied the behavior. And I think one of the great strengths of your work is that whole idea of context. You emphasize how much context and ecology was vital to all of Darwin's thinking, and how essential interaction rather than competition was. And there are some really, really good examples, I think, that you have of that willingness that Darwin had to study, to observe, to learn, and then to make decisions. And that's such a wonderful answer, I think, to so much of the kind of top-down thinking that we're seeing in schools and education. So that's not a question, that's a thank you. And really grateful for that contribution that you've made. I'll give you a brief opportunity to respond to that thanks.
So you dropped out then, I'm sorry to say. So can you just repeat what the end of you were talking about, how Darwin was very sensitive to behavior and to context, and then my connection dropped out briefly, but it's back. So
right, I was complimenting you on that real clarity about the importance of interaction and ecology and environment and understanding the totality of things, and Darwin's model, which was really observe, learn, then make decisions. You know, and it was a kind of thank you for that. I was giving you the opportunity to respond to it before I threw another question at you.
Yeah, well, thank you, David. I think what I was impressed by is that even with the Galapagos Island finches, we sort of think, well, what he observed was the finches all had different shaped beaks. So this is a story that in a little archipelago to the west of Latin America, where a small flock of finches seems to have landed there some people think 600,000 years before Darwin got there in 1836 or whenever it was. And by the time he got there were all sorts of different finches that looked the same in terms of their feathers, but had very different shaped beaks. And he thought, well, it's obviously an example of what we call now adaptive radiation. Each of the finches that landed on a different island specialized in a different food. Some of them ate insects off birds' backs, and some of them drank blood, and there is a vampire finch there, and some of them ate big fat nuts, and some of them drank nectar, and they all had different shaped beaks that would help them do those things. But the thing that actually led to those changes in beak shape were behavior, were dietary choices. And dietary choices must have led to the evolution of those beaks. So once you know about the environment, and you know about the history, and you know about the behavior, you can explain the structure. And I think that role of agency and behavior in the evolutionary sort of history, or the picture of evolution we have, has sort of been missing. And of course, for psychologists, that is the focus. It's like we've suddenly realized that agency and what animals and plants do is crucial to how we evolve. And suddenly psychology takes front place in the Darwinian sciences, which I'm very happy about.
Yes, and I'm going to take us right back to that idea of social Darwinism, which from a personal point of view, I think is probably the most damaging aspect of the approach that we've taken to Darwin. And social Darwinism has been used with its emphasis on competition. It's led to the political use of eugenics. It's been used to support racist theory. It's been the greatest abuse, I think, of all of Darwin's work. I mean, I don't mind a couple of biologists having a bit of a rammy about the nature of epigenetics. That seems to me less harmless than the way that these ideas have been translated into the political sphere. Whereas what your work does, I think, fundamentally, is challenge that. And what you really reintroduce, if I can use that term, into Darwin, are the three key concepts of cooperation, interaction, and development, all within an ecology, a big, much bigger framework. And I think the implications of that are huge. I think it brings humanity right back to the forefront of our thinking in all sorts of areas. So just again, Ben, to give you the opportunity to talk a bit more about your views on that.
Yeah, so a little bit about the social Darwinism and the claim that Darwin is a racist. So Darwin is a complex author. He was living in the Victorian era, and a lot of people say his books are a bit like Dickens. They're that complicated and there's that many subplots that it's very easy to cherry pick a couple of quotations and say, yes, he's a racist, or whatever narrative you want to push, that's the one you can push because you find a quote that fits with it. But he came from a family, his grandfather, his father were anti-abolitionists. They fought against slavery. His grandfather was Josiah Wedgwood, who made the anti-slavery medallion, which became the badge of the abolitionist movement. Darwin hated slavery. A lot of people think that it was the main motivation for his work, which I would challenge, but I think it was an important strand of it. He was taught taxidermy in Edinburgh by a freed slave. That's how he learned how to stuff and preserve animals. And so he had good relationships. And on the Beagle, there were 3 natives who'd actually been kidnapped by his captain from Tierra del Fuego at the icy heel of Latin America, who would bring returned there, and he made friends with them. However, it is possible to find he obviously had some kind of traumatic experience in the icy tip of Latin America, Tierra del Fuego, and he says some terrible things about the Fuegans and so on. But to come to your point about how he thought human progress should be understood, social Darwinism, so the first thing he said, if you look at the way human beings in a civilized society, by which he meant Victorian Britain, look after their populace, you will find that they look after the aged, the ill, the mad, the handicapped in a way that natural selection would say was stupid. That we should let them all die out. However, he said, if we did that, if we weren't sympathetic to the people who are in need and who are handicapped in some way or disadvantaged, we would give away our civilized status. We would undermine the sympathy, which is fundamental to being the kind of human society we should be. And then he said, and that doesn't really matter because human progress depends in a subordinate degree on natural selection. It's about education and social institutions. So he addressed social Darwinism and rejected it. And he did it in the name of sympathy and cooperation. And he even included animals in that. He said the true hallmark of a civilized society is how we treat animals. And he actually engaged in a campaign with his wife Emma, who was equally pro-animal rights, to ban steel traps as used by gamekeepers.
You are really stressing the importance of belonging. So we've talked about collaboration and connection. And because I, in my work, talk so often about the science of connection, I just want to bring in one other word. You are talking about the importance of a sense of belongingness, not only for human beings, but for the other creatures on which we live in this world. Does that word fit for you?
Definitely. It's actually, we've had a series of grants to actually investigate belonging, particularly in childcare. So it's very front of mind for me, Suzanne. I think the thing about belonging, everybody can use the word, but what does it actually mean psychologically? And it relates to groups again. So Darwin believed that the way that our conscience develops, our sense of moral right develops, depends on the group in which we live and the structure of that group. And we can take various different positions, moral positions within a group, but the great pressure is to conform to the values of the group. Now, he didn't believe that. He actually called conformity an abject state. He didn't necessarily think conformity was the goal of moral development, but he said it's a huge pressure because we are group animals. And so belonging is fundamental, but what we belong to and how it's organized is also something that obviously teachers would think about, is what kind of belonging, or early educators in childcare, what kind of group is a healthy group to belong, and how is agency, individuality, how is that to be preserved and encouraged within the context of a group? But that's some way down the track from your focus, Suzanne, on belonging, because I think belonging is, it's what we need. I think we've often construed it through the mother-child relationship or through the educator-child relationship individualistically in terms of attachment. But I think belonging is more of a group concept. And certainly it was fundamental to how Darwin thought we'd evolved, and the skills we have, the form of our social skills and equipment, if you like, is group-based. It is really something that responds to that larger group context. And I think a good word for it is belonging.
So exciting. David, do you want to wind us up? Last question.
Ben, this has been an absolute privilege. And if you haven't already received it, my gift to you is a book called This Thing of Darkness by Harry Thompson, which is a brilliant novel describing the voyage of the Beagle and talks a great deal about Darwin from a different perspective. So I will work out some way of getting that to you and recommend it also to our listeners. You've been wonderful company. You've given us wonderful insights. We're going to round up with the last question that we're asking everyone in this series. And it's really, what might you like teachers listening to the interview now to do with your ideas?
Well, I think there are two things. One is to perhaps rethink some very fundamental beliefs we almost take in with the intellectual air we breathe about evolution, that it's actually, as Darwin said, the battle for survival is not incessant. There are lots of happier aspects to the way that we've evolved than just competition. Cooperation is what he called mutual aid is important. And then secondly, I think just the group idea, just try. I don't think it's easy to think about groups, particularly when there are more than three. We know all about the triangle of jealousy and so on. But once we get beyond three, we don't really have the language, and it's really pioneering work. But please take up those ideas, which are to be found in the writings of a man who we all think we know, but I don't think we really have read him very closely. And when we do, we see that there's a really optimistic and, I think, humanizing foundation that we come into the world with. We can rethink how we come into the world and what our nature is. And it's a much prettier picture, I think, more humane picture than perhaps we have previously assumed.
Ben, it's been more than a pleasure. It's been a privilege.
Thank you.
If you would like to know more about this new perspective on Charles Darwin's work, then you will be glad to have affirmed that Ben Bradley's new book is already out. Darwin's Psychology, the Theatre of Agency, is published by Oxford University Press. As we said at the outset of this program, it's already gaining enthusiastic responses, such as the reviewer who described it as a very original book covering ground that has not been dealt with before. This captures exactly the reason that we wanted to invite Ben Bradley to take part in this first series of the Ideas Hour. And we thank all of you listening for joining us too.
This has been the Ideas Hour, brought to you by Suzanne Zeedyk and the real David Cameron.